welcome back to Sextras,
where we talk about sex and all the extras.
I'm Honey.
And I'm Maria.
And today we have an amazing episode for you guys. We're really, really excited. We have journalist and author of the memoir Open, Rachel Krantz, on, and she's talking all about open relationships, as the name suggests.
Yes, we just recorded the episode and she was so nice and told us like so much about her life. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
So definitely check out the book after you listen to this amazing episode. Obviously.
Yeah. And yeah, she really touched on like all of the aspects that we talk about on the podcast, like bisexuality, BDSM,
communication, like just so many things. And we'd really wanted to do an episode about like non-monogamy and talk a little bit more about that. So that was like super fun, and I'm really glad that Rachel came and talked to us.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Should we do a quick little zone recap before we get into the episode?
Yeah, let's do it.
What zone are you in, hun?
Quite white zone today. I've kind of gone out of my red zone, you know.
How are you starting your 23rd year?
Oh my god.
It was Honey's birthday, guys.
Yeah, it was my birthday. I'm feeling 22.
Yeah, you should have said that. That should have been your answer.
Yeah, I'm feeling happy, free, confused and lonely at the same time. So the yellow zone, the not purple zone, the grey zone, and the black zone.
But in the best way.
But in the best way. No, but yeah, very like white vibes. I'm just like focusing on myself, you know, like self-care.
Love it. Is the red? It's about out the window now, is it?
Yeah, it's gone. The
have
phase
you quenched
has
that
gone.
thirst?
No, I haven't. It's just gone.
Yeah, I mean you
Have
yourself.
I? No, I haven't even. It's just dwindled away.
Oh god.
What about you?
Okay, that's good though. Good for you not being in the red zone no more. I'm in the yellow zone, you know, always, as always. But I actually had a realization this week, guys, that I think I'm securely attached now.
Oh my god. Don't shock me with this news.
No, I mean, I'm probably like not fully, but I have noticed like quite a few things that I'm like, wow. Like, I was thinking like, wow, is this what it's like? Like, is this just the life that I've been missing? Like, so many things. It's like, I never know when the last time my boyfriend texted me was. Like, that's wild. That's wild shit. I like don't think about him. I like keep forgetting that we're meant to call. Like, I just forget because I just haven't been thinking about it. It's like, wow, this life is crazy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Never thought I'd hear this news.
Yeah. Never speak too soon, but I genuinely like so many of my, you know, anxious attached worries and like day-to-day living is just not a thing. Like, it's just not.
That's so good.
Yeah, it's honestly crazy. Like, I won't be like, oh, he like forgot to call me. That means like he hates me and like doesn't miss me anymore and like never thinks about me and like wants to break up with me. Like, that doesn't happen. It's wild, yeah.
Wow.
So extra yellow, you know, a new like, you know how like everyone sees different colours. Yeah, it's like new shade unlocked.
50 shades of yellow.
Literally. But yeah, that's me and my feelings.
Cute.
And I'm excited for this episode-ini.
Yeah, let's get into it with Rachel. Okay, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Could you tell us a little bit about what inspired your book before we jump into the conversation?
Well, when I was in my first open relationship, about a year and a half in, I was writing some articles about jealousy, trying to process it and understand it just as a reporter because I was struggling with it so much. And I was out about being in an open relationship but not really writing about my personal experience with it. And an agent approached me and said, you should write a book about this. You know, like, I haven't seen something that's memoir and journalism. And I said, yeah, it's a good idea. I thought maybe in the future, but I'm literally sick to my stomach. Like, I'm not an expert. Everything I've read about this, it's by experts. And she was like, well, just start writing things down. And I was already keeping a journal. So that idea kind of became a guiding, I don't know, light or coping mechanism of this sort of idea that maybe one day I would defeat my jealousy and live to tell the tale. And as I was having all these different extreme, you know, intense romantic and sexual experiences, and the central dynamic with my primary partner, Adam, was getting increasingly unhealthy, and I felt pressure to adapt to non-monogamy at the pace he seemed to demand. And it eventually devolved into a lot of gaslighting, where he was saying, you know, no, you're remembering things wrong, or you're misinterpreting reality, or all that kind of thing, that I was like, okay, I guess I better have some sort of record of reality, because apparently I'm not able to remember things correctly anymore. And so it became this sort of coping mechanism of this idea that maybe one day there could be a book, was a reason to record my experiences as I was having them, so that I felt some sort of sense of control in this situation where I felt very powerless, or very much like I couldn't trust my own perception.
Oh wow, so you wrote it like very much in real time, like...
Well, I recorded it in real time. I didn't write it in real time, but what I started doing was, you know, besides keeping a journal, recording over audio, like on my phone, with people's consent, you know, not just interviews, but also, you know, arguments with Adam, every therapy session, like instances I was being emotionally abused, like just kind of everything. Sometimes, you know, BDSM role-playing scenes, like I just ended up with so much tape, more than I knew what to do with by the time I decided to write the book. So yeah, as I was living it, I was trying to hold on to the experiences, or was sort of taken with this idea that maybe it could be, you know, something like an accurate representation of what was happening, even though, like, that's pretty much impossible, because everything is just a snippet, right? Even if you record days and days of your life, like, that's not your life, and that's not the people you're recording. But as a memoirist, you know, sitting down to write this book, and a journalist, it was an incredible resource, because I could reconstruct a lot of the dialogue in the book from audio transcripts verbatim. You know, it wasn't just my memory. It was really based on tape, like an article would be.
Yeah. And kind of makes it impossible for anything to be refuted, I guess.
Yeah, that's crazy. Did
Yeah.
you kind of just decide to start recording these things, or is this like a habit, like you just record stuff that goes on in your life, or did you kind of do it with an intention of maybe writing about it?
It is a habit I've had sometimes in the past. You know, I was working as a journalist since I was a teenager, really, and often working with first-person journalism. But then when I, you know, helped found Bustle and was features editor there, and I was writing as well, that was like part of that personal essay machine. And there was a kind of formula of like, I tried this and here's what happened. And so we do a lot of those kind of like experiment articles. So I was already kind of doing that a lot. But I was also really sick of the pace that was demanded. And so it was like this way of, again, feeling like I had some sort of sense of power of like, all these really interesting things are happening, so I'm going to record them, but I'm not going to write about it till I'm ready. And, you know, that hopefully I'll own the copyright to it, as opposed to with those articles at Bustle, like, I don't even have the right to have them taken down. I don't own what I wrote. So it was a sort of, again, like this attempt to kind of have more power over my story. But yeah, this was more than ever before. And I think because, you know, I think the first time I remember recording like that, I was a teenager or something, and my mom was yelling at me in like very like crazy mean ways, and I remember just, you know, being alone with it and feeling so guilty and so powerless and so manipulated. And I remember just kind of, that was the first time I turned on my phone and was like, okay, it's this witness of like, I'm not alone in being talked, you know, there's someone seeing I'm being talked to in this way that's really harmful, even though I never, you know, did anything with it. So I think a similar impulse started to arise, especially with Adam, when I was increasingly, you know, being told all this really harmful stuff, and also was, you know, this was all during Me Too, and so I was witnessing all these women coming forward with their stories, and even though I couldn't admit to myself yet that I was in that kind of situation, I did see how like people discredited them for not having evidence, right? And how like with the Kavanaugh Supreme Court justice, his hearings in the United States, that all these women came forward and accused him of sexual assault, and it wasn't enough evidence even that their therapists had records of them talking about it, you know, in their notes from decades ago. And so I was like, okay, I guess it's not enough to like have a therapist vouch for you. Like I need to have, you know, like audio records. And so I think that's part of what's really cool and interesting about the book is like, yeah, most people don't have these kinds of detailed records of how emotional abuse unfolds so incrementally and subtly, and how complex it is, and like what gaslighting actually is, in a way that then psychologists in the book comment on and dissect. So I think it's really cool, but it's also like very sad that I felt like I had to do this, otherwise like no one would ever believe me. And I think what's been interesting seeing it come out is that it does afford me credibility, but then there's some people who will say, well, she was recording her life, so it must not be authentic. She was probably just doing it for the material. And that's less common a critique, but I do think that's interesting and indicative of how women are put, you know, in a trap of like, either you're, you know, you don't record, but you tell your story after and your memory is unreliable, or there's no evidence, or you do keep those records, like my case, and have all this evidence, and people say, you're inauthentic, you were just doing it to get attention or tell a story. So you see how either way, it's a way of silencing people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, but also not surprising at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe let's backtrack a bit in terms of, we haven't actually talked about polyamory on the podcast before, so could you just give a brief kind of description of polyamory, whether that's what it means to you now, what it meant to you at the time, and just overall?
Yeah, so polyamory is a type of non-monogamy where people believe in more than one love, right? It's kind of in the word. So the idea that you can love more than one person, have more than one emotional relationship. People practice in all kinds of different ways. They might have a primary, secondary model of polyamory where it's kind of like one relationship takes precedent, and that might be the person you share the bulk of your time and resources with, like an open marriage or something. And then the other relationships are considered, you know, secondary if emotional, but maybe it's not as big of a part of your life. There's other people who practice something called relationship anarchy or non-hierarchical polyamory, which is more like, let's not have these predetermined levels. Each relationship is unique and different. You need to negotiate it with everyone, and it can be evolving. And then polyamory falls under the larger umbrella of non-monogamy, and that would be like anything but monogamy, right? So it could be what we just talked about with multiple relationships, but it could also be things like swingers who might only go to parties together or do things as a couple. There might be people who only have the occasional threesome together. There might be people who have a don't ask, don't tell policy, or you're allowed to make out with other people. You know, people have all kinds of other non-monogamous arrangements that might not, in practice, look like anything different than monogamy from the unknowing person for the outside wouldn't ever know. And we know in the US that 22% of people have engaged in some form of consensual non-monogamy at some point. And that's people who admit to it and who are ascribing the label to it. But I think that one thing that's interesting to think about is that a lot of what we just call dating is often non-monogamy. It's just maybe not consensual or talked about. So there's kind of that expectation of like, until we have that conversation, maybe you're, you know, seeing other people or dating other people. And then the expectation is just kind of like, you're going to choose a person and you're going to try to give it a shot. And so I think a lot of people have that plus cheating. They have practiced non-monogamy if they think about it. It's just maybe not been above board and talked about or consensual.
Okay. And with Adam, was that with, as in you had a primary partner and he was your primary partner and you saw other people as well?
Yeah, so when I met him, which is in, you know, the first chapter of the book is our second date before we kissed, and he tells me that this is the way he believes in being in relationship, and he very much framed it as like, if you were with me, you would still have the freedom to do whatever you want, but that he was really looking for a primary partner, someone to share his life with, kind of that traditional thing in a lot of ways. And so he was incredibly dominant and brilliant and compelling and literally a professor studying the psychology of romantic and sexual desire. So I was like, wow, okay, he knows what he's talking about. Like he's literally studying how to maintain desire in a long-term relationship. And like, this is what he said. And I'd heard of non-monogamy and I thought, okay, well, serial monogamy hasn't been working for me. I was 27. And my pattern was I would kind of fall in love, start to feel like bored and trapped, break up with the person, repeat. And I was just kind of hoping I would grow out of it. You know, that was kind of the, relatable to a lot of people. I felt like that pressure to, you know, find my one and this bullshit that women are socialized with of like, hurry, you're running out of time. Like anytime now you're going to, you know, get over the hill by the time you're like 32 or something and no one will want you anymore. And so I felt that pressure even at 27 to like find this magic person, but I also didn't really have a genuine desire to only, you know, fall in love with one more person for the rest of my life or to never kiss anybody new again, never go on a first date again. So I think when he offered that, I could potentially have both. I thought, oh, okay, here's someone older and more experienced, and why don't I try it? But the idea really scared me. And so for the first year almost, he made me the offer where he was like, look, I'm very serious about you and committed to you. This is more like my philosophy. So how about I'll be monogamous until you allow otherwise? And so at first, it was only us having experiences together. He revealed that his kink was seeing me with other men, and I was like, okay, cool, like that sounds fun. I didn't even like know that was a thing, you know. I think I'd heard about like threesomes with women, and I knew that was a common fantasy, but I had no idea it's such a common fantasy for men who sleep with women to see their partner with another man. And you know, there's some men who like participating in touching the other man, but in Adam's case, it was more like what's called hot wifing, where it's all the attention is focused on the woman and it's more of like a competition, and then he would enjoy kind of winning afterwards. And so for me, it was like this very ego validating, safe way to kind of explore non-monogamy at first, to see the potential benefits, but I wasn't dealing with jealousy or anything. And then about a year in, I met a waiter at like my local hangout spot, and we started kind of making out on our own, and I felt bad that it was only open on my side, so I opened it up on both sides. And that's when he started dating other people, and I started really contending with jealousy.
Wait, so when you say a year in, was this like a year of you guys sort of just having this kind of like threesome scenario, or like this cup holding scenario kind of thing?
Yeah.
So it was just that, and it wasn't like anything beyond that, just to clarify, sorry.
Right, until I met this waiter, and then we would, that was pretty casual, but we would hang out on our own.
Okay.
But I think pretty much within a month of that, I was like, okay, you're free to do what you want, because this feels unfair. Because it wasn't something I was sharing with him anymore.
And by that time, had you sort of like, I guess, opened up your head more to sort of the idea of non-monogamy? But as you said, you were still, that's when you really started dealing with jealousy.
Yeah.
So it was more like, was it kind of like in theory you had been like, okay, yeah, I'm into this, like I see the benefits or whatever, and then when it kind of came to practice, you were like, oh shit, this is real or whatever?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, he said that the idea was to ease me in, to let me see the benefits for myself in total safety, and that he thought that would be the best way for me to adapt. And he was probably right, because I got to experience all the benefits without any of the hard parts. And I totally saw how, for me, like, it felt very natural to have experiences with other people, very exciting and enlivening and more authentic. It felt like it reaffirmed my commitment to him, because, it was like, wow, this person's so confident, they're letting me do this. And what's more than that, they even like enjoy it. But yeah, I think that I knew, oh God, even the idea of him being with other people makes me feel so jealous and nervous. I guess as a journalist and a sort of emotional explorer, and just someone who really wanted to give him that kind of freedom back, because I knew he would require it eventually, and I wanted to be with him. And by this time felt I had very much bought into the narrative he'd established of like, we were the best people for each other, and like this was it. I was like, okay, I want to do battle with this, because I think it'll be interesting. Like I had never thought of myself as a jealous person. Like I thought, yeah, sure, I'm anxious, or I have these other negative traits, but jealousy was not something I was familiar with as a emotion. And I could tell it was going to be very informative and humbling as a emotional experience, because it was the first time where I really couldn't make like my physical reaction match up with kind of my beliefs or what I wanted it to for like very prolonged periods. So, I'd feel like at first when I was adapting, like achy, and my stomach was upset, and just like fight or flight response and all this stuff. And I'd be like, oh my God, they haven't even like had sex yet, and I'm having this incredibly intense reaction. And I would try to talk to myself and be like, just calm the fuck down. And then, but my body was not cooperating. And it was very humbling. And also like, wow, I didn't know this much fear of abandonment exists in me, this much insecurity, all these things. So I kind of felt like if I can, unlearn these things, or no longer believe them, or not let this control me, maybe I'll feel really powerful in the world, because it's like, what could be more challenging to your ego than seeing your partner who you're deeply in love with, go off with someone else for the whole day.
Yeah. It sounds like such a roller coaster of like full 180 from being, because I'm the same, like I'm super avoidant. I get freaked out by intimacy, and I had a similar experience when I started seeing someone who was also seeing other people, and I knew that I didn't want anything monogamous, but it was just super intense, those feelings of jealousy that I had never experienced before. So yeah, could you talk a bit about how, because it sounds like quite a liberating experience, like even though you're going through this process of negativity, in a way you are kind of reaching a more freeing or liberated place. And then how did that lead into the emotional abuse that you experienced?
Well, I think a lot of what was interesting is that these seemingly conflicting truths were constantly coexisting. So, on the one hand, I was becoming more liberated. I was coming into my bisexuality. I was having all these kinds of different experiences and feeling just more free and like less shame over all my desires, discovering new kinks. And yeah, just feeling in some ways also in combating jealousy stronger, and like just powerful in terms of, wow, I'm brave that I can sit with these difficult feelings over and over again and I keep, surviving. On the other hand, I felt like in a perpetual state of anxiety a lot of the time. I was like self-medicating by a few years in with a lot of weed and like, over-exercising and all these things to just feel like okay, or like I was escaping myself. And as there was more and more gaslighting and him kind of saying that my jealousy was illogical and therefore like not a valid emotion, and was like an immature, unloving response to be trained out of me, there was kind of this paradigm of like, anytime I'm feeling jealousy, like this is just my problem to overcome, rather than us being in a dynamic where it was like, okay, why are you feeling jealous right now? Is there anything I can do that would help you? Or like, can I like sit with you while you feel that? And I understand, and so that would further perpetuate my jealousy, because it's very hard to feel safe or secure when someone's telling you like you shouldn't even be having this response right now, or that feeling, or you're throwing a tantrum, you're being ridiculous, or is telling you like nothing's changed, when it really feels like so many things have changed because now they have another girlfriend or all these other things. And so I think you see how both those things are true at the same time throughout the story. And they're not necessarily, it's not this binary of like, either non-monogamy is like liberating and potentially feminist, or it's like used by men to coerce women into, having more sex or doing whatever they say. It's like sometimes it can be both those things are happening at once and are both true. And in my case, they were. And I think that's because I was finding out that non-monogamy really is a good path for me, but the way I was practicing it with Adam, the person I was practicing it with, was not a healthy dynamic. And so that's why I was having that conflict. Was like, on the one hand, it was really good. On the other hand, it was really not.
Yeah. I mean, it's confusing enough to be in any situation that's emotionally abusive, but having to separate those two things must have just been...
And the other thing that was very confusing was that it was also my first dom-sub relationship, but he did not admit that it was. So he kind of looked down on BDSM and said, like those people are just pretending, which is like a real red flag, right? Of potentially like an unhealthy situation of if someone is very obviously the dominant one in the dynamic, but they view themselves as being outside power dynamics or power structures in relationship, or don't want to talk about boundaries or rules and get annoyed if you bring it up. That a lot of what the story is about is a sort of cautionary tale of that. And that was very confusing because he was my first dom, and he really was just like a natural dom, and there were certain things that where he abused that power, but also certain things that were just great and that I was finding out I really liked. And I called him daddy in bed, and he called me his girl, and I dressed the way he wanted, and like followed all his rules around the house. And these are kinds of things that from the outside, for people who don't have experience with BDSM, it's like, okay, that's a controlling, abusive relationship. What the hell are you doing? Dressing his way or whatever. But the thing is, there can be really healthy dom-sub dynamics where the sub really enjoys that. But again, the difference is that they, even if it's like a 24/7 kind of role play, or not even role play, but dynamic, that there has to be ways the sub can, you know, say, stop, like, I'm not okay with this. Or the way the sub can say, like, you know, what are our boundaries or rules around this? Here's what feels good for me, like an acknowledgement of this is what's happening. But for us, he kind of was like, this is just us. So anytime I was upset, I felt like all this double isolation and shame, because I knew what was happening was not good. And he would say, don't talk about it with your family or friends, because you're going to incriminate them against me. You know, don't express your doubts. So that's like very red flag. But also he would say, you know, well, other people just don't understand non-monogamy. And implicit in that was also like, other people aren't going to understand this dom-sub dynamic, and they think I'm just controlling you, but like really you like that. And it's true. I did, parts of it I really did like, and have carried forward into my, you know, current primary relationship, where it's another, you know, kind of conscious daddy girl dynamic. But the difference is like, we talk about it, and there's like boundaries and safe words and rules, and there's ways to like come out of it. And that's the lesson I learned that was really important with that.
Yeah. I'm interested how you have continued to explore open relationships, because as I said, like well, no, actually I didn't say this, I said this in my head, but I experienced a really toxic situation with my first relationship, and it was with a girl, and I'm bisexual, and now I really struggle to date girls because of that experience. So yeah, could you talk a bit about how you've kind of moved from a toxic open relationship to having healthy open relationships?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sorry you had that experience. It's tough. There's a lot of ways that you see me getting at towards the end of the book, in terms of I went into an intense period of just introspection and celibacy once I came out of that, and really established a meditation practice and other practices to sort of help me regain a sense of trust in my own mind and capabilities and judgment. So I think like having that foundation, first of all, was very important, because it helped me feel more self-respect and clarity around what my boundaries even were in the first place. And that's something I also have different experts addressing in the book. You know, I'm sort of, it reads like a memoir, novelistic, page turning, but there's all these experts kind of contextualizing in the footnotes or in the text itself of like, I'm sort of the case study, right? So it's like, learn from my mistakes. So yeah, I have someone commenting on like, here's exactly how you might go about figuring out what your boundaries are, because that was like a very confusing thing for me throughout. But I found that, you know, besides learning that from her since and thinking about it, that when I came out of that situation and started meditating, and also just having had my boundaries so consistently violated, I felt like I had a much clearer sense than before of what they were. Like it was almost like a reflex of like, okay, like I'm way more sensitive now to if someone's trying to usurp my identity or, you know, tell me they're gonna like rescue me from my life or is trying to change me. And in a way that makes me feel like I'm not, you know, fundamentally okay unless I'm a different way. So I think, yeah, just having that clear sense of boundaries and self-respect also helped attract more the kind of people who were healthier because I wasn't in the same place of I'm looking for someone to complete me and, you know, rescue me and deliver me to my adult life. I was much more like, I'm a really strong person who's very resilient and like, I know I'll take care of me no matter what. And so that's obviously going to be more attractive to people who aren't trying to change you, who are also secure in themselves. So I think it just kind of creates a good cycle with that. And then I think it's also just recognizing that it has less to do with the relationship model itself or the gender or the, you know, kink, and more to do with like, how are these people coming together and what is the power dynamic between them as people and what are they triggering in each other. So, you know, I think that it became clear to me that in a different kind of dynamic where I felt much more secure and more of a sense of control and ability to, you know, press pause and more confidence that this person was not going to leave me, then my experience of non-monogamy was going to be extremely different, because it was just like, yeah, you're still practicing non-monogamy, but you're starting from such a different point. So I guess my hope would be that, you know, for you, if you decide to explore being with women again, that it would be like, okay, less about, you know, the fact that this is another woman and so therefore it's going to be a certain way, and more just like, what is this person's personality and do they treat me with respect, and what do I know, what have I learned from the past from all my relationships about, you know, red flags or things that are signs of incompatibility or ways that we might be triggering each other's shit in certain dynamics that I can watch out for. And one last thing I'll say about that is that I also have found it useful to think about the fact that you can really love someone and they can really love you. I think a lot of the times, like when we talk about emotional abuse, it's kind of, I felt, or abuse in general, like I felt even more trapped because I was like, but we really love each other. And I know he really loves me. He's just really not doing it in a good way sometimes, or he's just so convinced he's always right. And that if he could just convince me to do what he says, that I would be happy, and he thinks this is the best way to love me. So I think it's first important to acknowledge that in those dynamics that are unhealthy or toxic, we're locked in them for a reason, and often the people really do love each other. But if you were to make a list of the symptoms and conditions that love is creating, what would it look like? So for me at that time, even though we really loved each other, it would look like I wasn't getting my period for like a year because I was so anxious. You know, I had lost a bunch of weight and was looking unhealthy because I was so anxious. I was smoking weed every day. All these things where it's like, clearly, even though we really love each other, like my body was like, this is not good. Whereas, you know, now I'm like, okay, it often feels much steadier. And as someone who's been more coming from this situation of like, no, love's supposed to be super dramatic and intense and like high highs and low lows, that sometimes that can feel really foreign. But then I remind myself, yeah, but look at the symptoms of this relationship or this love, that since you've been in it, you've written a book, like your health is so much better, you sleep well, you're not compulsively smoking weed. So clearly, like, that is creating conducive conditions. So I think that's another really helpful exercise to look at, is what are the symptoms of your loving relationship? And if it's negative, that doesn't invalidate the fact that you're in love. It just might not be a good fit.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's a lot to take in.
Sorry, we went a long rant there a little bit.
Oh no, but it's so helpful, I think, for people to understand and be able to compartmentalize different like emotions and experiences in their minds, and it's definitely something that's helped me. And yeah, I think touching on the side of toxic relationships, whether it's in an open relationship or in a BDSM dom sub dynamic, yeah, you have to really recognize that it's not necessarily the label of the relationship or the status of the relationship, but it's just the person. So yeah, really good advice.
And it's hard because there's so few representations of these marginalized groups, so then they want to present their best foot forward because there's so many stigmas. But then the problem is then people who are not in those lifestyles can't really relate to it because they're like, you're claiming you're perfect all the time or you never have bad relationships. And it, and what's more than that is it further alienates people who are, you know, in non-monogamous relationships or BDSM relationships that have gone to an unhealthy place because they're like, I'm not allowed to talk about this, or, you know, maybe it's just like I'm the one weird freak who's not good at this or something. So I think it's really important to talk about the whole spectrum of what can happen because, of course, like just like queer relationships can be sometimes abusive or fantastic, and monogamous relationships can be sometimes abusive or fantastic. Anytime you have people coming together in different personalities, you're going to have any range of outcomes. But yeah, people like to blame it on the label when it's, or the model or the dynamic, that it's stigmatized, so it's just easier to blame it on that rather than the people.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah, and when you're outside something, it can be super hard to understand where it's coming from, but then being inside it, it's like it just feels so different and so much better. So could you tell us a bit about now your perspective of monogamous relationships and like what you think you've learned and what you look back on your past relationships and think, oh my god, I can't believe, you know, I ever thought that way or acted that way?
Well, I mean, I think that monogamy is a totally valid and good choice for a lot of people. You know, it's a trade-off of more security, not having to deal with jealousy, or maybe just, you know, not wanting to be spread thin in any way. You don't have enough time for it. I totally get why people would choose monogamy, and I think it can be beautiful when people do that deliberately. I think the issue is when it becomes the standard default assumption and assume that the only way you can really love someone or build a long-term future with them is if you're monogamous, and that leaves a lot of people feeling like deadened inside or failures if they're having any trouble with long-term sexual desire for their partner. And women especially, I think, you know, there's increasing evidence from sex researchers that, you know, we might have more difficulty with lack of novelty or variety. And there's this kind of old evolutionary narrative of, oh, men want to spread their seed while women want to like lock it down. But that evolutionary theory, while I'm sure there's some grains of truth to it, like many theories, was created by white men in the 1800s under a patriarchal capitalist system who were, you know, reflecting their own biases of like, oh, why is this that all the men are allowed to like do whatever they want and the women just stay home without any sexual desire, and this, you know, kind of Victorian idea of what women's desires are, and, you know, had that theory. Whereas when we look to the animal kingdom, there's, you know, female non-monogamy everywhere. And it's on both sides for sure. And that there's plenty of reasons to think sperm competition would also be a motivating factor for, you know, women who sleep with men from that perspective. But just in terms of more contemporary research, there was one British study I found really interesting. It was of 11,500 people of like a wide age range. And it found that women in relationships over a year old were less interested in sex, and that the effect was more pronounced if they lived with their partner. and that after 90 months there was like this steep cliff of drop off of desire, whereas for men after that point it actually held relatively steady. And I know just anecdotally, friends who are female, friends who are male, that, you know, despite the stereotype that men are more likely to cheat, they might just be, you know, less likely to get away with it or more likely to admit to it, because now women have really caught up to that rate and just seem also anecdotally to be the ones who complain to me much more about feeling bored and restless and like they wish they had some novelty. So yeah, I think that there's nothing abnormal about having difficulty with long-term monogamy, and so that it should just be allowed to be a conversation in relationships, and that there's a wide spectrum in between total monogamy, you can't do anything with anyone else till you die, versus, you know, polyamory, no you know, hierarchies, and there's like 5 partners. There's all this stuff you could do in between that might not be as threatening to, if you want something a little more traditional, but you just want some novelty or some more freedom. That I think it would be great to see, you know, more people feeling like they have the ability to explore.
And like, if you are someone that you think you might be sort of interested in non-monogamy, or you kind of want to explore it, do you have any advice on like where to start, both in just like actually start doing it, and also just in like unlearning all of this stuff that we've been talking about, like all the jealousy and all the like these ideas of possession, and sort of like you can only love one person, and it's not possible like to love more, or yeah. Do you have any advice?
It's definitely a journey that, to some degree, like everyone has to do internally on their, you know, do battle with on some level on their own in terms of unlearning, but it's also really important to have help. So I would say, you know, read books. Like mine has a ton of great resources in it of other non-monogamy books. You could get an idea of which ones might be good. Kathy Labriola, who's my counselor, who's in the book and also writes about non-monogamy, she's excellent, and she has a book called Love in Abundance that really addresses a lot of what you were just talking about, of how do you unlearn those paradigms or examine them. What is jealousy really all about? She also has like a jealousy workbook. I like hers a lot. And I think it's very important to see if you can find a counselor. It's tough, I know, but there's lists online of like kink-friendly professionals, or if you search non-monogamy friendly therapists, you know, sometimes they're only specialists and it can be harder to afford, but there are also directories of people that might be covered by insurance, and that way you have someone who's a little more experienced in these dynamics and isn't gonna like ascribe any problems in your life to the fact that you're non-monogamous or that you're kinky, but they're going to be looking at what are the relationships like themselves. And then finally, to find some sort of community is really important, so that you don't end up more isolated, or in a situation where, you know, you're not sure, is this a person manipulating me or abusing their power, and you have no one to ask about it. And that can give you a sense of what are kind of the ethical standards of these communities. How are they practicing in a way that's healthy? And you can find, you know, Facebook groups, local meetups, things like that. I think it's very important to have other people around you who can also say you're not crazy for trying this or for wanting something different than everything society's telling you you should want.
Yeah,
for sure. Could you speak a little more on sort of what helped you, like specifically in your jealousy, like from dealing with like all this jealousy to sort of breaking that down and it becoming more manageable? Like did it like sort of click for you one day or something?
I think that I struggled throughout. I did have kind of like an exposure therapy experience of where by the end of it, even though I was obviously still not doing well, things that would have bothered me a lot in the beginning were like nothing. So it was like, you know, where I started out, like them even going on a first date and not even kissed, like made me sick to my stomach. By the end of the time, that was like, that's nothing. And I was, you know, he had another girlfriend. He, you know, would sometimes have people stay over when I was out of town, things that would have felt like unimaginable to me before. But I think I never really did feel totally comfortable or good with any of it because, again, the reasons we talked about of my jealousy was kind of viewed as this character flaw, and also that I didn't really feel that ultimately I could say no for more than a few weeks and not lose him. So I think, and I also found out in retrospect things I won't ruin that are revelations in the book, but there had been things he'd been hiding. So I think, you know, Kathy Labriola writes that jealousy is like a smoke alarm. It's there to, you know, alert you to the fact that there might be a fire, but it's up to you to check, like, is there actually a fire or do I just need to change the batteries? And so I think in that case, the jealousy was often trying to alert me that there was a fire, like that I was being lied to, that, you know, I was not being respected, that this was not a healthy dynamic. Whereas I think experiences now, it tends to be much more fleeting and comfortable, at least so far. I'm always humble about that, but because I just really I trust him in a way that I realized I never really trusted the other partner, and I feel safe in ways that I never felt safe. So it's just, I think that was the real difference, was changing the dynamic into something where I felt like there was just a stronger foundation, and realizing how much of jealousy can often be about the fact that you just feel like you're going to lose that person at any moment anyway, or you just feel like you don't have any power in the dynamic. All of that is really, it's a symptom.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like I never thought of it as that. I'm always like, oh, like, yeah, as you were saying, I always think of it as like a problem with myself rather than with the situation.
No, and I mean, that's also not to say that you can't be in a healthy relationship and experience intense jealousy. In fact, you definitely probably will, you know, even when you're first adapting, because it's just very intense. And that's where I think, you know, having that help of a counselor, reading lots of books, having community will help you parse out, okay, do I just need to change the batteries, aka learn to sit with this discomfort, learn behaviors I can do to distract myself, and kind of negotiate a way that you can be okay more and more with the anxiety or with the emotion, and sit with it so that it becomes less powerful.
Yeah, I think it's like how we were saying earlier, it's more about the situation and like, yeah, the dynamic between two people rather than the label or the feeling or like, because, yeah, as you said, like if you feel jealousy in a relationship in which you trust the person and you like can communicate the feeling, and it's like, you know, it's approached with compassion and not just like dismissed or whatever, then you can feel like, yeah, you feel like you can feel your feelings and you like can move forward and kind of like, yeah, okay, this is just natural, like this is gonna pass. Whereas if you're feeling jealousy in a very like insecure situation, like it's more than jealousy, it's like kind of deeper than that, I feel.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's interesting. Situation, like you have to really look at situation and dynamics rather than like umbrellaing things together as a whole.
Yeah.
And one distinction I really have found helpful is from the meditation teacher Tara Brach, who's excellent. She's a psychologist, and she talks about real but not true, and the ability to hold both those things at once. So with my jealousy, I could sometimes see, or thought I could see, how it was based in beliefs that were not true. So the idea that I was unlovable or that he was going to leave me the next day. But because they weren't true, the problem was he was unable to acknowledge them as real. He felt like acknowledging those feelings as real would just enable the untrue beliefs, and kind of keep the cycle going. But what Kathy writes about in Love and Abundance is that like it's very important for a partner in that situation, even though they might find it unattractive or annoying that their partner's feeling jealous, or they might feel really resistant because they don't want to be restricted and they're excited about someone new, to be able to hold space for their partner to have that feeling and not try to say, oh, nothing's changed, or like, you should see that I'm never going to leave you or whatever, but rather say like, okay, even if I don't think that your jealousy is based in truth with a capital T, it's real. It's an emotion you're having right now. And so I can sit with that with compassion and see what I can do to help you feel better, basically. And yeah, that's a whole different way of approaching it that I've just found is way more effective for me, I think, for probably anyone, because it's based in so much more compassion and mutual respect, and communication is required much more for that. And those are things that are going to help any relationship, monogamous or non-monogamous.
And I feel like it helps. Sorry, I know you. Just really good. I feel like it really helps making that separation of like what's true and what's like, you know, what's true and what's real. Because when you can communicate about it and talk about it, then you and your mind can also be like, okay, yeah, this is like real, but it's not true. Like, I'm talking to this person about it now. Like, we've come to the conclusion, like the realization, and like it's even further than just like, you know, when you come to realizations on your own, when you're like, yes, I can rationally see that this isn't true. When you kind of like voice that out loud and are able to say it, and then it's like it's reassured, then it's all like, okay, this is, you know, going away quicker and quicker, like this feeling, this negative feeling.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just on this point of like communication, I know we've touched on it briefly, but I was wondering if there's anything else for even people who aren't interested in exploring polyamorous relationships, if there's anything you think that people can learn from polyamory if they're in like a monogamous relationship.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to create spaces for regular check-ins and not wait for conflict is one thing I've noticed non-monogamous people sometimes tend to do more often or encourage more often, because there's just like logistically you might need to like have regular check-ins, or about like scheduling, or about, you know, renegotiating an agreement, or all these kinds of things. And I think that monogamous people would also be wise to do that, to have kind of regular check-ins that are in the calendar or something, of like, how are we doing? Is there anything I could be, you know, are there any new fantasies you've been having? Is there anything that would, you know, make you feel safer in this relationship or situation? You know, I think those are all good questions that maybe people in non-monogamous relationships are often talking about, because they're being more open about their potential wide range of sexual desires or having new experiences. And also really, if it's going to work, having to be concerned about how do we navigate you having the right amount of freedom with my feeling safe, and that it's kind of this dance of like freedom and safety. And I think that, you know, really ideally any relationship would have an awareness around that dynamic, because even if you're monogamous, there needs to be space for desire to function. People need to have lives that are not completely codependent, opportunities to have individual experiences, their communities and friends. And I think that, you know, some people might be feeling trapped in a monogamous relationship, not because they actually want to be non-monogamous, but because they just feel kind of restricted by the fact that you're supposed to live with someone and see them every day. And maybe that's not actually right for everyone. Maybe some people would be better off living apart, but still monogamously. Or maybe some couples would do better where one person travels more, or, you know, basically where they have just more distance and desire built in, or you know, more opportunities of they're not at home together all the time, the same time. So yeah, one other way that during quarantine, when that was obviously difficult, that, you know, my partner moved in, and even though I was still non-monogamous in the sense of I was still talking to someone else and having an emotional relationship with someone else, physically we were monogamous, and around each other every day, because I was like, yeah, this is not like worth it to me to risk this before a vaccine. And I found like there's actually a lot to be gained from having this period of just kind of really deepening this commitment and how well we know each other. But I found that I was often feeling like restricted just by like not having any privacy anymore and not having the distance to miss him. And so if there was any conflict, it was often like me kind of being passive aggressive or like distant in an attempt to get that personal space or just have that sense of like separate self again. And so we started this idea of every week, 1 day a week, we have like day of silence in the calendar. And it's like the expectation is that's our day to do our own thing. And even though we're still often home at the same time together and living together, we don't talk to each other that day. And in the beginning, we were much more strict with it of like, we didn't text each other. We would try to really just like pretend the other person was invisible. And it was so great because it was like having a fight without actually fighting, of like you get that sense of distance and like, you know, personal space again and silence. And then you get to like come back together and realize like you have new stuff to talk about and maybe feel more desire and like the makeup sex without the fighting, because you know, got to look at them from afar and be like, oh, I wish I could talk to him right now, but I can't. So I think there's lots of things like that couples could work in to just have more sense of individuality and space and creativity and playfulness, of like, you know, just having conversations around like what would be fun and good and healthy for us. Like, screw what other people think, you know, what is the way that we would be setting ourselves up for the best success and happiness, and that sense of, again, the dance of freedom, but also security.
Yeah, just the idea of balance overall is what's screaming to me in every single one of these points of like the permanence and the impermanence, the freedom and the security, just everything. Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Thank you. Yeah, do you have any more questions?
Any more questions? Well, I was a little bit curious about sort of like you'd mentioned a little bit about like discovering your bisexuality and stuff, so I was just wondering whether you could kind of talk to us a little bit about that, like how that came about, like what happened, what's going on now.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, so I mean, I had those feelings since I was a kid, but kind of pushed them down, or was like, oh, you know, it doesn't seem strong enough, or it's probably, if I was bisexual, like it would have happened by now. But I was always putting, you know, I was like an early adopter of online dating, and when I was like 22, I was putting bisexual, but just not having a lot of luck with women, because it was so much easier to let men come to me, and I was kind of more into the dynamic of usually like being the one pursued, and I didn't find that women were often pursuing me and were kind of writing me off as probably straight. And so I had a lot of imposter syndrome around it, and kind of some early experience, but, you know, nothing serious. So again, I just sort of pushed it down. And then when I got into this open relationship, I realized, oh, like here's an opportunity for me to, you know, explore this, because I don't have to choose between the genders. Like I don't, you know, like this is a whole new paradigm of like, it's not a matter of like, who would you rather be spending your whole life with, which just felt like so much pressure. And was a way I just sort of invalidated my bisexuality, because when I would imagine that forever person, it was almost always a man. But also a lot of that is probably because that's what I've been socialized to want, and that's what like every single movie had showed me, and every book I'd read, and you know, everything. So like, of course, the fairy tale imagination was that. And I found that in the parties we went to at first, the sex parties, those were spaces where it was a lot easier to have experiences with women, where it was kind of the expectation was like women play with other women, a lot of times for benefit of the male gaze, which was confusing. But for me, it was like, oh yes, this is awesome. Like this is such a easy way to like gain more confidence in you know, my ability to make a woman feel good, also in just the fact that this is really a real thing for me. But I didn't want to lose my virginity to like an anonymous woman at a sex party. I was kind of waiting for someone special, and then I meet Miranda in the book, and she was that person for me, and that was just an amazing experience to realize, oh, I could have feelings for a woman, and enjoy experiences with her, you know, alone without men present, and just sort of untangle that. But I definitely have still felt a lot of, even despite all that and having had other experiences since, a lot of imposter syndrome, because my most serious long-term relationships have still been with cis men. And it wasn't until I read Jen Winston's book, Greedy, and became friends with her. And, you know, that book is a lot about what bisexuality actually means and the kind of history behind it, and all these feelings I saw echoed of my own experience, and fears and ways I invalidated myself, or ways the both straight and queer community had invalidated me, that I was like, oh yeah, okay. And she kind of encouraged me to own the label more. And I found that since I have, it's just been like a huge weight lifted of feeling like I'm not lying to myself or other people. And she talks about how bisexuality is often thought of as a verb instead of an identity. So there, as if there's this sort of like, you have to have enough homosexual relationships or experiences to like prove it's real, in a way that we don't usually demand that of people who are, you know, gay or straight. And I also just learned in researching the book how bisexual women have the highest rates of sexual assault, drug abuse, eating disorders, and mental illness, more than gay or straight populations. And you really see that mirrored in my story. And that also, yeah, it was sad to realize, and also gave me some sort of reason to own the label more proudly, because I think that, yeah, there's just something that really, unfortunately, people take advantage of when you're a woman who's not easily put in one of these boxes, and also just a way in which it can be very damaging psychologically when it's so easy to hide within straightness, but you know there's this side of yourself that you're sort of not living the truth of, or not allowing yourself to explore, or kind of gaslighting yourself as like it's not even real. Yeah.
Yeah, I think like every bisexual woman in particular feels that.
Yeah.
We talk about it all the time. And yeah, it's definitely
Internalized biphobia.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you said that about how bisexuality is viewed as a verb rather than a noun, that's just yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for touching on that.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think we've kept you long enough. Thank you so much.
No, it's been great. Thank you.
And could you tell everyone where they can find your book, where they can find you, everything that's important?
Thanks. Yeah, this was a great conversation. I appreciate you having me. You can find Open where books are sold at your local bookshop, or, you know, request it if they don't have it in stock. And you can also find it anywhere, you know, online on the major retailers or local ones. You can find it. And you can find me at Rachel Krantz on Twitter and Instagram. That's my handle, is just my name, Rachel Krantz. And that's great. I post most of my updates on there, so you can keep up with what I'm up to. And yeah, I just love hearing from people. If the book ends up making you feel seen in any way or makes any difference in your life, that really helps me to hear, so that I just feel like I have this whole army of love and support around me, shielding against any judgment or hate that comes my way, and is always very appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone should go read the book and express their appreciation. It's so important. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to Rachel for joining us, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. And if you have any other thoughts about polyamory, any questions, anything that we didn't touch on about non-monogamy or anything, literally anything, just let us know. You can find us
on Instagram at Sextras Podcast, Facebook Sextras Podcast, email us sextraspodcast@gmail.com. Go to our website www.sextraspodcast.com. We have all our episodes are in categories on our website. Yeah, so you can search by like episodes with guests. We have loads of other amazing guests too, and by like episodes about dating, sex, everything. So definitely go there, check it out, and you can like send us anonymous submissions on there as well. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and yeah, we will see you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to Sextras, presented by Honey Jane Wyatt and Maria Jose Hayodatiyi, produced by Mabel Productions.